The Pacific stretches empty in every direction, a vast blue emptiness that seems to confirm what Japanese naval doctrine has proclaimed for 18 months. This ocean belongs to the Kido Butai, the striking force of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stands on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, the flagship that has led Japan's carrier fleet from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, from Darwin to Ceylon, victorious in every engagement. The morning air carries the salt smell of the sea and the kerosene tang of aircraft fuel as deck crews prepare the first strike wave. Around Akagi, 3 more carriers, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, steam in formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being armed and fueled. In the ready rooms below, pilots drink green tea and review their attack plans with the confidence of men who have never known defeat. What none of them can see, what their reconnaissance has failed to discover in the pre-dawn darkness, is that they are not alone on this ocean. 240 miles to the northeast, 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown, are launching their own strike waves, their pilots climbing into cockpits knowing they are outnumbered, outfought in every previous engagement, but also knowing that this morning, for the first time, they hold the advantage of surprise. The empty Pacific that seems so vast is about to become very small, and the ocean that Japan claimed as its domain is about to dispute that claim with a violence that will rewrite naval warfare forever. By sunset, 4 Japanese carriers will rest on the ocean floor, and with them will sink the illusion of Japanese naval invincibility. The Pacific War did not begin at Midway. It began in the calculated aggression of December 1941, when Japanese forces struck simultaneously across an ocean they had spent decades preparing to dominate. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not an isolated gamble, but part of a coordinated offensive that seized Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, and the Dutch East Indies in a campaign so swift and comprehensive that it seemed to validate every assumption of Japanese naval supremacy. By March 1942, Japan controlled an empire that stretched from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands, from the coast of China to the Central Pacific, an area encompassing more than 10 million square miles of ocean and containing resources, oil, rubber, tin, rice, that made the empire economically self-sufficient. This expansion was built on a naval force that had no equal in the Pacific. The Kido Butai, commanded by Admiral Nagumo and containing at its peak 6 fleet carriers, represented the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled. These were not the converted cruisers and experimental designs that other navies fielded. These were purpose-built carriers, ships designed from the keel up to project air power across thousands of miles of ocean. Their aircraft, the Zero fighters, the Kate torpedo bombers, the Val dive bombers, were flown by pilots whose training programs had lasted years, who had honed their skills in combat over China, who could place a bomb within meters of a target or execute a torpedo attack in conditions that would ground lesser aviators. When these forces engaged Allied naval units in the war's opening months, the results seemed to confirm Japanese doctrine so completely that it bordered on prophecy. At Pearl Harbor, 8 battleships sunk or damaged for the loss of 29 Japanese aircraft. In the Java Sea, an Allied fleet destroyed without the loss of a single Japanese ship. In the Indian Ocean, British carriers Hermes and Cornwall sent to the bottom in engagements so one-sided they resembled target practice more than combat. Japanese pilots returned from these missions with stories of enemies who fought bravely but ineffectively, of Allied aircraft that burned after single hits, of ships that maneuvered predictably and died accordingly. This string of victories created within the Japanese Naval Command a psychology that was equal parts confidence and complacency. They had trained for decades to fight the United States Navy, had studied American doctrine and capabilities, had designed their ships and tactics specifically to overcome American advantages in industrial production through superiority in training and initial striking power. The opening months of the war suggested that this design had succeeded perfectly. American carriers existed: Enterprise, Lexington, Yorktown, Hornet, Saratoga, but they had been absent from Pearl Harbor, and in the subsequent months they had been ineffective, launching pinprick raids that accomplished little except to demonstrate that American naval aviation was qualitatively inferior to Japanese.
What Japanese naval intelligence failed to appreciate was that American carriers were not avoiding decisive battle out of fear. They were avoiding it because they were outnumbered, because their pilots were less experienced, because their doctrine was still evolving, and most importantly, because they understood something that Japanese planning had not fully accounted for. Time favored America. Every month that passed without decisive engagement was a month American shipyards built more carriers, American training programs produced more pilots, American intelligence gathered more information about Japanese capabilities. The Japanese had won the war's opening round decisively, but they had not ended the fight, and in failing to end it, they had allowed their opponent to prepare for the next round. By May 1942, Japanese Naval Command faced a strategic dilemma. Their initial objectives had been achieved. The resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia were secured, the defensive perimeter established. But American carriers remained operational, and as long as they did, they posed a threat to Japanese expansion and a symbol of unfinished business. The Battle of the Coral Sea in early May had demonstrated this threat clearly. Though the Japanese had achieved a tactical victory, sinking the carrier Lexington and damaging Yorktown, they had been turned back from their objective of capturing Port Moresby, New Guinea. For the first time, Japanese naval forces had been forced to retreat before achieving their strategic goal. The engagement revealed something troubling. American carriers, even when outnumbered and fighting defensively, could impose costs that made Japanese victories pyrrhic. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet and architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, understood the implications. In his strategic calculus, Japan's window of opportunity was closing. American industrial mobilization was beginning to accelerate. Every month brought new ships, new aircraft, new pilots to the Pacific. If Japanese naval superiority was to be converted into permanent strategic advantage, it had to be done soon, in a decisive engagement that would destroy American carrier strength and force a negotiated peace. The target he selected was Midway Atoll, a speck of coral and sand in the central Pacific that held significance beyond its size. Its capture would extend Japan's defensive perimeter, threaten Hawaii, and most importantly, force the remaining American carriers to come out and fight under conditions where Japanese superiority in numbers and pilot skill would prove decisive. The plan Yamamoto developed was characteristically complex, involving multiple carrier groups, battleship formations, invasion forces, and diversionary attacks on the Aleutian Islands. It assumed American forces would react as expected, would position themselves where Japanese planning anticipated, and would fight the battle according to Japanese preferences. These assumptions were not unreasonable. They were based on doctrine that had proven successful in every previous engagement, but they shared a common flaw. They assumed the opponent would cooperate. What Yamamoto did not know, what Japanese planning could not account for, was that American cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese naval code JN-25. Intelligence officers at Station Hypo in Hawaii, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had intercepted and decrypted enough Japanese communications to understand not just that an attack was coming, but where, when, and with what forces. This intelligence allowed Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, to position his carriers exactly where they could ambush the Japanese strike force. The empty ocean that Japanese reconnaissance failed to search thoroughly was not empty at all. It was occupied by American carriers waiting in ambush, their presence unsuspected, their strike aircraft ready to launch the moment Japanese carriers were located.
On the morning of June 4, as Japanese aircraft attacked Midway's installations, American carrier aircraft were already in the air searching for the Kido Butai. The initial attacks, torpedo bombers from Hornet and Enterprise, were slaughtered. They came in low and slow, and Japanese Zeros shot them down with ruthless efficiency. Of 41 Devastator torpedo bombers that attacked, 35 were destroyed without scoring a single hit. Their sacrifice seemed to confirm Japanese superiority, seemed to validate every assumption about American inferiority in aerial combat. Japanese fighter pilots, having massacred the torpedo bombers, were at low altitude, their aircraft low on fuel and ammunition, when the next American strike arrived. 37 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown appeared at 14,000 feet, their approach unnoticed in the chaos of the low-altitude battle. They rolled into their dives at 10:22 a.m., and in the next 5 minutes, they rewrote the Pacific War. Their bombs struck Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu with precision that seemed impossible, setting off catastrophic secondary explosions as Japanese aircraft, armed and fueled for another strike, were caught on the flight decks. The three carriers, which had been preparing to launch a decisive counterstrike, transformed in moments from instruments of Japanese power into funeral pyres visible from 40 miles away. The fourth carrier, Hiryu, escaped the initial strike and launched its own attack, damaging Yorktown so severely that the American carrier would eventually sink. But Hiryu's success was temporary. American dive bombers found her in the afternoon and delivered the same devastating attack that had destroyed her sister ships. By evening, all 4 Japanese carriers were sinking or abandoned, their aircraft gone, their pilots dead or swimming in the Pacific, their proud history written in fire and oil slicks spreading across the water. The Battle of Midway lasted 3 days, but the decisive action occurred in those 5 minutes on the morning of June 4. In that brief span, the balance of naval power in the Pacific shifted permanently. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers that could not be replaced, at least not in the time frame that mattered. More critically, they lost the irreplaceable pilots who had fought since Pearl Harbor, the veteran aviators whose training and experience represented a decade of institutional investment. American losses were severe: 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 145 aircraft, 307 men. But these losses could be absorbed, replaced, made good by an industrial system that was just beginning to demonstrate its capacity. The symbolic object that recurs throughout accounts of Midway is not Japanese, but American, the dive bomber. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was not a remarkable aircraft by any objective measure. It was slow, vulnerable to fighters, and carried a relatively small bomb load. But it possessed qualities that made it the perfect weapon for the Pacific Carrier War. It was rugged, able to absorb battle damage and continue flying. It was stable in a dive, allowing precise bomb delivery even by modestly trained pilots. And most importantly, it was producible in quantities that made losses acceptable. Where Japanese dive bombers were crafted with attention to performance optimization, American dive bombers were designed for mass production and ease of training. The Dauntless embodied the American approach to the Pacific War. Not the best weapon on an individual basis, but good enough and available in numbers that made best irrelevant. After Midway, the Pacific War entered a new phase. Japanese naval forces remained formidable, still possessing battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and several carriers. But they could no longer project power with the casual dominance that had characterized the war's first 6 months. Every engagement now had to be calculated against losses that could not be fully replaced. Meanwhile, American naval construction was accelerating. The Essex-class carriers, massive ships displacing 27,000 tons and carrying nearly 100 aircraft, began entering service in 1943. They were joined by light carriers converted from cruiser hulls and escort carriers built on merchant ship designs. By 1944, the U.S. Navy would operate more carriers than Japan had possessed in its entire pre-war fleet. But the transformation was not merely quantitative. American naval doctrine, which had entered the war uncertain and evolving, crystallized around lessons learned at Midway and subsequent engagements. Carrier task forces became the primary striking arms of the fleet, supported by battleships and cruisers that provided anti-aircraft defense rather than leading attacks. American pilots, initially inferior to their Japanese counterparts, benefited from training programs that rotated combat veterans home to serve as instructors, creating a feedback loop where tactical lessons learned in battle were systematically transmitted to new pilots. Aircraft designs improved based on combat experience. The F-6F Hellcat replaced the inadequate F-4F Wildcat, purpose-built to defeat the Zero using tactics American pilots had learned through bitter experience. Japanese naval aviation, by contrast, entered a death spiral from which it never recovered. The veteran pilots lost at Midway could not be replaced with equally skilled aviators because the training programs required years to produce proficiency at that level, and Japan did not have years. Replacement pilots arrived at the front with a fraction of the flight time their predecessors had possessed, and they died at rates that made experience accumulation impossible. Japanese aircraft designs, which had been superior in 1941, were not updated rapidly enough to match American improvements. The Zero, which had dominated in the war's opening year, became increasingly vulnerable as American pilots learned its weaknesses and American aircraft achieved performance parity or superiority. By 1944, American carrier task forces operated with an impunity that seemed to mock Japanese pretensions to Pacific dominance. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese naval aviation launched its largest carrier strike since Midway, 400 aircraft attacking American carrier groups defending the invasion of Saipan. American fighter direction, radar-controlled and coordinated, intercepted the Japanese formations and destroyed them with losses so one-sided that American pilots called the engagement the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Of the 400 Japanese aircraft that attacked, 330 were shot down. American losses totaled 29 aircraft, with many of those due to operational accidents rather than combat. The kill ratio, more than 11-to-1 in America's favor, represented not just tactical superiority, but systemic dominance across every aspect of carrier warfare. The carriers themselves told the story of this dominance. Where Japanese carriers in 1944 struggled with fuel shortages, inadequate replacement aircraft, and undertrained pilots, American carriers operated with logistical support that seemed to belong to a different kind of warfare. Fleet trains, mobile supply ships, followed carrier task forces, providing fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, and replacement aircraft without requiring the carriers to return to base. An American carrier could remain at sea for months, conducting operations continuously, while Japanese carriers had to return to port after each major engagement to refit and resupply. This logistical dominance extended to damage control and repair. When American carriers were hit, and they were hit in battles across the Pacific, they demonstrated survivability that Japanese designs could not match. The carrier Franklin bombed off Japan in March 1945 with casualties exceeding 800 dead, was repaired and returned to service. The Enterprise, hit repeatedly throughout the war, survived every engagement and earned 20 battle stars. Japanese carriers, built with less emphasis on compartmentalization and damage control, tended to become total losses when seriously hit. The 4 carriers sunk at Midway had been destroyed as much by poor damage control as by the bombs themselves. The secondary explosions and uncontrolled fires that consumed them were preventable with better design and training. By late 1944, Japanese carriers had become scarce enough that American carrier groups operated in Japanese home waters with minimal opposition. The raids on Tokyo in February 1945, conducted by 16 American carriers striking targets within sight of Mount Fuji, represented a symbolic inversion of the Pacific War's beginning. Where Japanese carriers had struck Pearl Harbor and escaped without decisive counterattack, American carriers now struck Japan's capital and operated with such overwhelming superiority that the attacks were more demonstration than desperation.
The final carrier battle of the Pacific War occurred at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, when Japan committed its remaining naval strength in a desperate attempt to destroy American invasion forces in the Philippines. The engagement involved 4 separate battles spread across 3 days and demonstrated conclusively how completely the balance had shifted. American carriers operating in multiple groups sank 4 Japanese carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, while losing 1 light carrier and 2 escort carriers. The Japanese combined fleet, which had dominated the Pacific in 1941, ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Its surviving ships retreated to Japanese ports, where they remained immobilized by lack of fuel for the war's remaining months. In the aftermath, American carriers operated with an impunity that previous generations would have considered impossible. They struck industrial targets throughout Japan, supported amphibious landings on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, hunted down the remnants of Japanese shipping, and prepared for an invasion that the atomic bombs made unnecessary. The ocean that Japan had claimed as its domain had become an American lake, patrolled by carrier groups whose numbers exceeded Japan's entire pre-war naval aviation capability. The transformation from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay took less than 4 years, but in that span, the nature of naval warfare changed fundamentally. Battleships, which had dominated naval thinking for half a century, were relegated to supporting roles. The carrier became the capital ship, the center around which naval power organized itself. And the lessons of the Pacific Carrier War, that numbers matter, that training systems matter, that logistics matter, that survivability matters as much as offensive power, became foundational to post-war naval doctrine. Japanese naval officers who survived the war and wrote memoirs consistently returned to a common theme. They had underestimated not American courage or even American material resources, but American capacity for systematic learning and institutional adaptation. One staff officer, reflecting on the trajectory from Midway to Leyte Gulf, observed that Japanese doctrine had assumed American forces would improve slowly, would remain qualitatively inferior even as their numbers increased. Instead, American forces had improved rapidly in every dimension: pilot skill, tactical doctrine, aircraft performance, logistical sustainability, while simultaneously increasing in numbers that made qualitative parity devastating. "We prepared to fight American amateurs in great numbers," he wrote. By 1944, we were fighting American professionals in greater numbers still. The dive bomber that symbolizes American victory at Midway flew from carriers that, by 1945, were themselves symbols of a larger transformation.
The Essex-class carriers that dominated the war's final year carried more aircraft than pre-war Japanese carriers, operated with greater sustainability, and were built in numbers, 24 completed before war's end, that represented industrial capacity Japan could never have matched. They were not individually superior to Japanese carriers in all respects, but they were superior in the dimensions that mattered most. They were tough, they were numerous, and they were backed by a logistical and training infrastructure that made them renewable resources rather than irreplaceable assets. Today, the Pacific floor holds the remains of carriers from both sides: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, Lexington, Yorktown, and others, resting in the darkness beneath waters they once controlled. Their locations are known, mapped by deep-sea exploration, and occasionally visited by submersibles that document the decay of what was once the cutting edge of military technology. These wrecks are monuments to the men who fought on them and in the aircraft they carried, but they are also evidence of a transformation in warfare that extended far beyond individual battles. The Pacific War demonstrated that naval dominance in the modern era depends not on initial superiority, but on systemic advantages: industrial capacity, training infrastructure, logistical sustainability, institutional learning capability. Japanese achieved tactical brilliance and initial superiority through decades of focused preparation, but tactical brilliance proved insufficient against an opponent who can absorb losses, learn from mistakes, and return stronger. The ocean that seemed so vast in 1941 proved too small to contain American industrial power once fully mobilized. The carriers that arrived at every horizon after Midway were not just ships, they were manifestations of a democratic society's capacity to mobilize resources at scales that authoritarian efficiency could not match. The Japanese claim that the Pacific was theirs lasted exactly 6 months, from Pearl Harbor to Midway. After that, it became contested, then American, not because individual American sailors or pilots were superior, but because the system that produced and sustained them was superior in ways that individual excellence could not overcome. The dive bombers that dove on Akagi that morning in June 1942 were carrying more than bombs. They were carrying the weight of American industrial potential just beginning to manifest, and that weight, once fully deployed, proved irresistible as the tide.